everyone. Welcome. And we're really grateful that you could be with us here today. I'm going to get started first with land acknowledgement, and then I'll go forward with some introductions and a little bit about today's talk. As a visitor here in Toronto, I am grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and play on the land where I am today, and acknowledge that this is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I also want to acknowledge that many of you may be calling in from other regions, given that this is a virtual talk that we're listening to today. And so I would ask each of you to reflect upon the lands that you're on today and think of what that land acknowledgement might look like for your region. And lastly, I would ask that we all take action with respect to the land acknowledgement. And so in doing so, I would ask that you spend some time learning about the Indigenous-led organizations that operate and work in the regions in which you live, and think upon how you might be able to support some of these organizations towards achieving the goals that they're working towards. So myself, my name is Billy Jo Hardy. I am assistant professor at the Dalalana School of Public Health. And I am here today moderating the Land, Borders, and Health lecture series. I've not been to one before, so I'm excited to sit through this today. The Land, Borders, and Health lecture series is offered through the Dalalana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, and it is a collaboration between Public Health and Migration, the Center for Global Health, the Wakabaness Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health, in partnership with the Global Health and Social Accountability Program, the Temerity Faculty of Medicine. And it includes a series of lectures on land, borders, and health. It is my absolute pleasure today to welcome Dr. Redvers. Dr. Redvers is a member of the Deninu K'ue First Nations in Denendeh, and has worked with Indigenous patients, scholars, and communities around the globe her entire career. I feel very lucky because I was also raised in the territories, and so it's exciting to welcome someone who comes from the same region as I today to speak about lands. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Family and Community Medicine and Department of Indigenous Health at the University of North Dakota. And there she has helped develop and launch the first Indigenous Health PhD program. She's also the co-founder and current board chair of the Canadian charity, the Arctic Indigenous Wellness Foundation, which is based in Yellowknife, NWT. And I would encourage that each and every one of you take a moment today or tomorrow to learn more about that program. She's actively involved at regional, national, and international levels, promoting the inclusion of Indigenous perspectives in both human and planetary health research and practice. And she is also, and I'm going to nerd out for a moment here, the author of the trade paperback book titled, and oh, you can't actually see it. There you go. And it's backwards, so that's not great. But The Science of the Sacred, Bridging Global Indigenous Medicine Systems and Modern Scientific Principles, which I would also encourage that you either take the opportunity. So I'm going to hand it over now to Dr. Redvers. She will speak for about an hour. We'll encourage you to post your questions, which we will come to at the end under the question and answer section. And we'll moderate questions and answers at the end of Dr. Redvers' talk. So welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Masi Cho, thank you. Just going to go ahead and share screen here. Bear with me for one moment. And if I don't hear anything, I'll just make the assumption that you can see my screen okay and hear me okay as well. Wonderful. Well, really appreciate that warm introduction and very happy to be here with you all today. And want to also just recognize the traditional lands of my home institution, which is the traditional unceded territories of the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota people. I am blessed and humbled to be able to transit and work as a visitor from the North in many territories, including my home territory in Treaty 6. And one of the things that I think is really incredibly important to start or situate ourselves as Indigenous peoples, as Indigenous scholars, as Indigenous community members. And I often start my presentations with a few slides that are the same, because regardless of which setting that I'm in or what I have stated before, I always have a responsibility to root myself to my origin, my family origin, my community origin, my lands, but also to set the context for how and why I speak. And from a clinician, from a researcher, from a community standpoint, I need to be in relation to my work, my culture, and my greater community. So it's important to locate myself in this purposeful way in order to demonstrate respect for, but most importantly, to remain accountable to all my relations, or Salotina, as we say in my Denisukline language. Now, it's important to note that my Indigenous ways of being in the world, or sometimes termed my ontology, in addition to my way of applying knowledge in the world, or sometimes termed my epistemology. And also my lived experience has been informed by tens of thousands of years of memories that are stored in my region's stories. And stories are our main method and rooted directly in the lands that we come from. Now, George Kajati really aptly describes this relationship by stating that the culture's vitality is literally dependent on individuals in community with the natural world. Indigenous cultures are an extension of the story of the natural community of a place and evolve according to ecological dynamics and natural relationships. Therefore, I must honor my ancestors and my elders, as anything I share or talk about is not my knowledge. It's not my expertise. This is a collective knowing of a group of people that stretches thousands of years passed down through our oral stories in our region by our peoples. Now, my own Indigenous clinical and research methodologies stem from a rooted, decolonized state of being that is premised on respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility, with direct underpinnings to the kinship relationships that we have and hold with all planetary elements within the world, ranging from the micro to the meta levels. Now, this methodology is also exemplified by how we utilize our terminology to demonstrate strength-based relationships to our land. And as an example, when we write within the English language, stating land or writing land with a capital L, being an entity with whom we have a relationship depicted through the symbolism of capitalization, versus land with a small l, or place, referring to a geographic place. Mother Earth compared, as this concept comparatively to Mother Earth as our mother. So the conceptualization to something is very different than the relationship to something. And this strength of relationship, again, really spans the micro to the meta levels. Now, the idea of how we formulate our relationships are really rooted in a framework of knowing that prizes interconnectedness as a basic and fundamental law. So in thinking through how we turn this interconnected relationship to all entities into a methodology for living well, for considering topics such as the one that we're broaching today. Well, there's already a methodology. There's been a scientific evidence-informed method in existence for thousands of years in how to live and know the world around us. Traditional Indigenous knowledge systems are based on sacred natural laws, sometimes called first laws or original law, which then define our traditional protocols, which then give a framework for both old and modern ways of knowing. Yet, in the spirit of scientific hegemony that has really pervaded most branches of Western clinical practice, research, inquiry, and governance, knowledge democracy has not really prevailed. And I always like to introduce this term, epistemological pluralism. Epistemological pluralism. It's a complex term, but it recognizes and appreciates that in any given research or practice context, there may be several valuable ways of knowing, and that accommodating this plurality can lead to more successful integrative study and practice. Now, of course, many may be familiar with Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall, similarly describing this as the gift of multiple perspectives through his two-eyed seeing framework, which has been widely taken up across the Canadian landscape and also abroad. Yet, this has not really been prioritized in many cases in our systems of learning or in applications in the real world to our complex problems. So before we can address real issues of equity in regard to any given topic, we must also understand how even ways of knowing, ways of being in the world, but also ways of carrying out inquiry are steeped in considerations of social justice and also the mere democracy of what we call knowledge. Now, a good example of this diversity in ways of being, in ways of knowing, and in how we apply those considerations to applied practice is even the way we view the term equity in society. And many have likely seen this picture, of course, depicting the difference between equity and equality, often used within public health circles, but also in conversations around the social determinants of health, with which, of course, you know, the left picture depicting this idea of equality with all of the members of the family receiving equal boxes to standing on. And then, of course, noting that the little one is not able to still see the game, comparatively to this definition of equity, where we give extra supports for those of our society that require a little bit extra to be able to have the ability to watch the game. This picture has been further described by, well, why is there a fence there in the first place, and removing it in terms of this concept of social justice. But the issue that is always with this picture, from many coming from minoritized communities, Indigenous peoples, is that why is the Brown family outside and not in the stands with the rest of the peoples? There's still this sense of isolation, this sense of distancing from community as a part of this. And the brilliant work of Abigail Echohawk, who's Pawnee, had really reconceptualized and thought through, well, what does this definition of equity really mean from other perspectives, including that of Indigenous peoples? And she depicted this beautiful picture and description of health equity when it comes to the self-determination or the self-determined describing of equity from an Indigenous context, which is saying, well, we don't even want to be in the game in the first place. So you see the crumpled pile of the stands in the corner on the left upper side of the screen. And this young woman has taken the wood from the stands and built a cradle board that she holds on her back and is going on the land of her ancestors, with her young one to pass on those generational teachings. That is equity. So why is there an urgent need for epistemological pluralism? Again, this appreciates that there's not only just different fields of practice, but several valuable ways of being, but also knowing in the world. And clearly the world has changed. We've went from what I call a circular and natural worldview to a square synthetic worldview. And the lens of the world really affects how we create research questions, how background knowledge is retrieved, but also operationalized, and how we consider the hierarchy even of our priorities, both in knowledge building processes, but also in thinking through solutions to some of our greatest challenges currently on the planet, such as that of the climate crisis. Now, in my community, in the past and present, we go out hunting and foraging and only take the amount of caribou or moose we need, no more or no less. And we still use and always have used every part of that animal, every part. And when we're done with the bones, the ones we haven't used, we bring them back to the land as an act of reciprocity, but also responsibility and respect. And today, individuals often will shop and buy things they merely want and not necessarily what they actually need, continuing this direct consumptogenic behavior pattern really rooted within capitalistic colonialism. And we've been sucked up into this colonial framework of worth and domination over things, natural or non-natural, tangible or intangible, forgetting the key difference between true need, want, and desire. So in thinking through how we get back to our origin, how do we get back and consider this aspect of decolonizing ourselves and teaching others the natural laws, but also the protocols that allow for a more sustainable world. And the health effects are very clear. The land is a healing place, not just because of what it provides us, but what it gives us in relationship. And we've really forgotten this as a society. Now, if you look carefully at these graphs, you'll notice a very clear pattern in almost every single one of them, regardless of whether or not we're talking about the trends of Earth's natural systems or socioeconomic trends in general that are relevant to our community's health collectively. And almost all of the graphs, of course, note a clear acceleration or exponential growth after about the 1950s, starting with the natural Earth systems. And, you know, much of this focus, of course, is not only on the effects of Earth, but also real effects on human productivity when it comes to things like transportation, but also domesticated land, and then, of course, population, including urban populations. Now, what comes to mind when you see this data in front of you, if you haven't already seen these graphs so up front? And you know, it's really striking the clear correlation between exponential economic growth with that of the destruction of Earth's systems. So there is what could be called this environmental public health chiasm, really meaning the stark intersection between these fields. And when we think about non-communicable diseases such as asthma and respiratory diseases that will be impacted by things like longer pollen seasons, for example, in allergies, or even higher particulate air pollution and its relationship to cardiovascular disease. When we appreciate that 6 out of every 10 infectious diseases come from animals, further exacerbated by changing habitats and also living in closer proximity with them due to farming and wildlife practices, as well as the degradation of ecosystems. So it becomes harder and harder to ignore our complete and utter interconnectedness with Mother Earth and these, you know, environmental changes and really know no boundaries. We also have increasing mental health concerns in this space with the lack of exposure to nature, ecological grief, climate change anxiety, or eco-anxiety, in addition to many of the other elements noted that have a direct relationship for us and our human-caused changes to the planet. Now, this is amplified, of course, in the context of forced migration due to climate change. And I often remind folks that when it comes to the forced land relocation of Indigenous peoples, and I'll touch on this briefly later, within multiple contexts. You know, many of the reservation communities, of course, were built on forced relocation from traditional homelands. So we're getting to the point now where certain Indigenous communities, at least in the North American context, may actually be forcibly removed a second time from climate change on top of previous relocation from colonialism. Now, the field of planetary health is really a Western construct. It's a relative newcomer to the space in terms of discussions. And although conceptualizations of planetary health have really been around in Indigenous communities for thousands of years, it was more formally defined in English really in the last 10 years or so. Now, its origins in Western applications were, to be frank, very anthropocentric or human-centric, we could say. But the field has evolved considerably. So by definition, just to root this terminology, planetary health is said to be a solutions-oriented, transdisciplinary field and social movement focusing on analyzing and addressing the impacts of human disruptions to Earth's natural systems, on human health, and all life on Earth. In 2018, Prescott and colleagues felt it was important to really further emphasize the interdependency, but also the scales of influence and the human constructions that really sits under this umbrella of planetary health, being obviously inseparably bonded, to the planet, both the vitality of natural and anthropogenic ecosystems, being inclusive of biologically defined ecosystems at multiple scales of influence, micro, meso, macro, that favor biodiversity, but really also including the more broadly defined human-constructed social, political, and economic ecosystems that favor or perhaps not favor health equity and the opportunity to strive for high-level wellness. And this definition is also inclusive of the business ecosystems that clearly influence sustainable and health-promoting local and global commerce. Now, from an Indigenous perspective, planetary health as a field, as I noted, is primarily a Western construct, as Indigenous traditional knowledge really has no clear separation between the health of the planet and the health of self, or even that of the community and that of the ecosystem at large. So what this interconnectedness means is that the meaning and applications of planetary health are directly rooted in community values based on traditional protocols for living in harmony with all that have existed for thousands of years. Now, given this, there is a continued and urgent need within the climate and health space, as well as many other spaces, to consider again the prioritization of epistemological pluralism that really elevates and grounds these greater planetary health discourses and also movements with stewardship practices, relationship building, and this innate sense of reciprocity that we have embedded in our traditional Indigenous knowledges around the globe. But this is not without first and foremost Indigenous peoples. Now, from an Indigenous perspective, planetary health is noted as innate due to this interconnected notion of the universe that we have that I hark on repeatedly. However, planetary health is really the closest way of thinking about this large interconnected system approach from my perspective. And I work with the term planetary health from an Indigenous perspective primarily. Now, it's important to note that I have seen increasing appreciation and calls for inclusion of Indigenous traditional knowledges in various spaces. And I want to highlight clearly that I specify Indigenous traditional knowledges in plural in these instances to recognize the diversity of Indigenous knowledges that exist around the globe. However, the knowledge, of course, does not come without the people. And we know Article 31 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People really clearly states this right of Indigenous peoples to maintain, protect, but also control their cultural and traditional ecological knowledges. However, unfortunately, these rights have not always been acknowledged. Now, one of the things that I've been concerned about with the increase in current momentum of large global change, whether or not it's climate goals, biodiversity goals, aspects of human migration, whether or not it's aspects of pollution or even the pandemic, is this continuing of promotion or amplification of traditional knowledges, including traditional ecological knowledge extraction, that really further perpetuates inequities and discrimination of Indigenous peoples themselves as peoples, because the knowledge does not come without the peoples. So if the world wishes to partner and work with Indigenous communities leading traditional ecological knowledge efforts, it really needs to understand established international agreements, which are not always understood very clearly, indigenously defined ethics, and then really be proactive in protecting intellectual property and also data sovereignty rights of local communities, really first and foremost. Now, there needs to be an increasing focus, of course, on amplifying Indigenous peoples and their voices, as opposed to only their knowledge alone, as again, the knowledge does not exist without the peoples themselves. And this is unfortunately very rarely appreciated in global circles in some of our great crises that we're dealing with. Now, there was a statement made by 60 Indigenous community members and experts who gathered to discuss traditional knowledge, things like climate change, food sovereignty, all inclusive of some of the crises that we've had in Mexico in 2018. And it was a convening organized by Cultural Safety and the International Indian Treaty Council, and is really a great example of this understanding of the need for respectful partnerships, but also being very firm on what partnership actually looks like from the Indigenous perspectives on some of these topics. And they stated, we recognize the extreme crises that we are facing through our Indigenous science and ways of knowing, and the realities we are living on the ground. If we agree to share this knowledge for the good of all humanity, it must be based on respect for our rights and the commitment by countries to implement real changes to their methods of production and concepts of development. Now, I mentioned previously that the lens of the world really clearly affects how we see our innate hierarchy of ourselves overall being on the planet. And I really love this figure by Lucero and Cruz, which really depicts this different sort of notion of how we think through our place in the world, with the figure on the right with the ego-I perspective, this anthropocentric, this human-centric, with humans really being at the top of the hierarchy and others kind of falling in underneath. Comparatively to here depicted the Mayan cosmocentric worldview, this eco-we, but this is very much appreciated in many Indigenous nations around the globe, this sort of holistic aspect of interconnection of relationship with no innate hierarchy when we consider decision-making, or how we look at governance, or how we look at knowledge and its applications for some of our great challenges. Now, health equity considerations in research and practice are thankfully becoming more common in our modern discourse. However, it's important to emphasize again here that health equity can be defined differently in different worldviews, given the picture that I had showed previously, or the figure developed by Abigail Echohawk as a response to some of the more common depictions of equity. So what I want to highlight from this equity perspective here as well is also the importance of interspecies equity. And you know, it's really seen from a place of relationship, a place of relationality. We are all interconnected with no hierarchy between us when it comes to how the natural systems operate in our world. And I talk about equity from many different lenses. On the previous slide, obviously, interspecies equity. However, we also have to understand notions of intergenerational equity, which really is a prime consideration for many Indigenous communities, often making decisions based on their effects on the next 7 generations to come. So some folks may have heard of the 7th generation principle, teaching from our Haudenosaunee relatives, but other nations also have conceptualizations of this as well too. And we have been mortgaging the health of our future generations to realize economic and development gains in the present, and why we need these conversations around intergenerational equity to be more common. So the largest takeaway, I think, you know, from my perspective, when it comes to connecting health equity and the needed forward steps to move us, you know, in a good way. And really, it's the understanding when it comes to the root causes and upstream drivers of climate change and health equity being often the same. And I really approach, you know, the conversation of climate change in the context of forced relocation for our relatives off traditional lands because of impacts they have barely participated to. So when you think about colonial upstream drivers and some of these root causes of problems, they often affect, again, socioeconomic health inequities, but also things like climate change and therefore forced land relocation. However, interventions that really act on these upstream shared systemic causes can most effectively address both climate change and health inequities. Again, our interconnectedness really has no limits. Now, this interconnected nature is really depicted by this figure here on the slide. We are really what we could call unified communities due to our interconnectedness on all fields, on all structures, on all influence. Yet there's also this clear interrelationship with repercussions for not living in balance with the planet, as what we call Earth-centered jurisprudence systems govern both natural and global systems. There is this absolute unity of the natural laws between us, between our other non-human relatives and the planet. The sun will absolutely continue to rise from the east and set in the west. The moons will continue to affect the tides, but Mother Earth will also respond to our interactions with her, which ultimately affects all other life forms. Now, we're really nested into these interconnected relationships with other innate but also applied knowledges, which then really impact the health of our communities and our ecosystems. And this bidirectional impact of various nested levels is incredibly important as we help to form our reality just as much as we are bound by some of these constants. And I really like to emphasize in this vision for a healthy future, it's really important to create the conditions that enable this overcoming of our dissonance as a society between this idea of being in nature or nature that surrounds us, or being on the land, land that surrounds us, comparatively to being of nature, to being of land, because nature and land embodies us. So I've mentioned natural law, first law, original law a few times. So what do we mean by that? Ultimately what we call natural first law, and again, these are the English translations. Many Indigenous nations have their own descriptions of this type of concept and reality within their own traditional languages. And natural first law is the way of living on land or country handed down through countless generations. It sustains a web of relationships between the human and non-human world and forms a pattern which is life itself. This pattern must be recreated and the law followed to sustain life. Now, Indigenous traditional knowledge is really directly nested within understandings of natural or first law, whose meaning is really uniquely rooted within the respective lands globally that we come from. And often our traditional protocols are how we translate some of this knowledge within the community settings. And as Elder David Kushir of the Anishinaabe Nation confirms, working in alliance with nature and her natural laws is the key to ensuring our survival. The reason we have climate change is because we have broken natural law. What is natural law, and how can we find our balance again? The spirit in each of our beings carries moral and ethical principles of what should be the basis of our human contact. We understand these moral principles as natural laws. Natural laws are innate to all living beings. They are the invisible laws that govern all life. All living beings, including Mother Earth herself, are governed by natural laws, whether they know it or not. And as we confirm and emphasize many Indigenous perspectives that there is no separation between ourselves and that of the land, with complete interconnections existing that really precludes an isolated definition. I really reflect on the words of Paula Gwen Allen, a Pueblo woman who very aptly stated, "We are the land, the earth is the mind of the people, as we are the mind of the earth. The land is not really the place separate from ourselves, where we act out the drama of our isolate destinies. It is not a means of survival, a setting for our affairs. It is rather a part of our being, dynamic, significant, real. It is ourself." And even our names and identities come from this deep and fundamental understanding. And I come from Dene peoples of Northern Canada, from the land called Denendeh, or land of the people. And if we actually break down the word Dene, in one of our Dene languages, in which there are many, we see that De means flow and Ne means land. So Denendeh is literally flowing from the land. The Denendeh have a relationship with land. Our very being flows from the land and the land from its people. And this concept of flowing from the land really roots us in the landscape and creates the culture. And as such, the teachings about land really serve as the essence of our being. And when there is separation from land, dysfunction will arise. So why is this all important for me to state in the context of this topic? And I think of the words of Chief Jan George, who was a chief of the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation. Many may be aware of him and his advocacy and his work for Indigenous peoples. And he said, "Allow me to learn the ways of your book knowledge so that I may combine it with my natural knowledge and lead the way." We as Indigenous peoples understand that a blend, especially our younger generation, of traditional knowledge with modern knowledges may be one of the only ways forward sustainably for our planet. And I emphasize here again the concept of epistemological pluralism, recognizing that in any given practice context, there may be several valuable ways of knowing, and that accommodating this plurality can really lead to more successful integrative study, solutions, and practice. And change is slowly happening. And I really believe it's a deep reflection of the values, vision, but also the purpose of what we're trying to do here as a collective community. But I also believe it was due to diverse voices standing up for their rights and showcasing the strengths that they offer to the global community in this time of great crisis and need. But it's also occurred by allies stepping up and stepping back to allow those voices to be heard. And although Mother Earth is a living system that can transform and heal herself, as my sister Ampolina, who's a Nikawina-Wara traditional custodian from the Martuwarra Lower Fitzroy River in Australia, she states that Mother Earth will be lonely without the vibrations of her human family. So we cannot forget in the complexity of the current issues we face that, as Terry Tiji, a member of the Takla First Nation, stated, "Take care of the land and the land will take care of you." Now, what about borders? And how does our experience as Indigenous people inform our view of them? Well, everything I have talked about before is relevant in some way to the conceptualization of borders, either as an origin or as a consequence. Now, this map here on the slide is a depiction of the US context of the process of colonization of Indigenous land spaces and the redefining of traditional land territories. We can see very clearly which directionality colonization came from. And in fact, there's substantially less Indigenous populations within the eastern part of the United States comparatively to the western portion because colonization came from the east. Simply by the directionality of Indigenous territorial integrity being compromised from the east and not the west, we really see the effective difference between traditional land borders in the west comparatively to the east. Now, if again, colonization had come from the west, we likely would have seen the complete opposite of this map. And of course, many have likely seen this map. The artificial borders, of course, between countries on Turtle Island really separates communities and families, disrupts cultural practices, disrupts subsistence activities, and tramples Indigenous sovereignty. And notice how I did not use the past tense here. With increasing global warming due to colonization and its effects on the planet, we also have border compromise within traditional territories. And this here was a picture shown by Letitia Pokiak, an Inuvialuit woman originally from my home territory of the Northwest Territories. And the picture shows her home community of Tuktoyaktuk completely surrounded by Arctic waters. And I'm sure you can see the potential impact of sea level rise, but also coastal erosion of Letitia's traditional homelands caused by colonization and its effects. And of course, climate change impacts her Indigenous community the most, yet her community has contributed the least to climate change. And the health impacts, of course, are being felt already within my home region, which is warming at roughly 3 times the global rate. And the Arctic regions of the world have already passed the Paris Climate Agreement set at no more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels due to the amplification process that happens in these circumpolar areas. So the integrity between land and water borders are becoming less and less. I continually mention this terminology of epistemological pluralism, again, perhaps more efficiently characterized as two-eyed seeing or that gift of multiple perspectives from Elder Albert Marshall. Yet there has been clear borders on even our ways of knowing throughout colonization that really prevents two-eyed seeing from being appropriately operationalized, as I have noted previously. We have not had a democracy of knowledge. However, we are slowly seeing a breakdown in what we see as traditional conceptualizations of colonial borders, but also knowledge borders. As we have seen pandemic infections passing borders easily, as pollutants also fly in the sky from one country to the next, or from connecting rivers between countries. As we see climate change, but also industrial development forcibly removing Indigenous communities from their homelands, just like, again, we were forcibly relocated onto colonial defined land borders called reservations in the North American context. We are starting to see an honest reflection of our current ways of living on land and with Mother Earth. And this has really been a reckoning for society, and one that greater society is having a hard time dealing with. This reckoning has been demonstrated by the increasing rates of depression and anxiety in our society, epidemic of loneliness, as folks are faced with the prospects of great change and an upending of lives than the way they have known it. And of course, that is also the case for Indigenous peoples living on the front lines of climate change, resource extraction, and of course, feeling these impacts greatly, not only in their environments, but also on their livelihoods, cultures, in their lives. Yeah, I can say that we do not have to lose hope. In fact, the false borders we hold onto are also our way out. And I can stand here and say that the elders from my region understand exactly how to monitor, to care for, and steward our caribou and other animal populations. They can tell you the pattern of the eddies in the water and what that means for safe travel, how to read the snow on the ice and the clouds in the sky to predict the weather for the coming days, and can tell you when an animal is sick. They can tell you when a plant is poisonous and the moment when that very same plant becomes a powerful medicine. They can tell you when the forest needs to be burned through the work of firekeepers to prevent large wildfires and to spur new growth and habitat. They can also tell you in great detail what has changed with global warming in our subarctic region. They can tell you about the ice that sounds different when it melts. They can tell you it moves differently when it flows on breakup. They can tell you about the new animals and plants that they now see. They can tell you how the fish skin and the consistency of the fish flesh has changed over the last years. And they can tell you about the new growths they are seeing in the caribou and the moose, the changes in the quality of the hides they work with due to ticks affecting the hides that never used to be there. They can tell you how the winds have changed, how the weather is no longer following the same patterns and is less predictable. In fact, they have been saying all of these things for decades, but nobody listened. Science is behind our elders' knowledge, as they are so fundamentally connected to the land around them. And this means that our elders are ahead of the scientists, and we still have them here for now. However, the value of our global Indigenous knowledges is platformed on our availability to our land bases, Indigenous rights and sovereignty, the maintenance of our languages, the recognitions of treaties with federal government, and allies willing to use their 2 ears over one mouth. And it's time now to listen without an agenda. It's time to listen and take guidance from our longest land stewards on the planet. Let this map be the new map, not to define geographical borders, but to instead delineate the flux of borders of stewardship responsibilities for the lands residing within the traditional territories of our Indigenous land stewards. Now, at the beginning of 2021, we brought together a group of Indigenous scholars, practitioners, land and water defenders, respected elders, and knowledge holders to define what we call the determinants of planetary health from an Indigenous perspective. And we wanted for once to place Mother Earth in the center and consider what are the determinants that keep her well? What are the factors that will make an impact for her well-being? And our group identified 10 main determinants of planetary health that fell under 3 main interconnected levels, really felt to be largely appreciated in their respective communities around the globe, which included Mother Earth level determinants, these interconnecting determinants between Mother Earth and Indigenous peoples, and Indigenous peoples levels determinants, all interrelated, of course, and depicted by the figure on the left with no hierarchy apparent. Now, I just want to highlight a few of these determinants here today, and I'm not going to go into detail on all of them, and will encourage you, if you want to see the paper online, it's available open access. The first is that I want to highlight is the human interconnectedness with nature determinant. And we wrote specifically that ecological demise points to an impaired human relationship with its inner self. Humans are nature and not apart from it. So in the broader sense, there is evidence of the loss of an ecologically land-bound cultural identity. And this disconnect from nature and land manifests as a fragmented and disassociated identity that cannot recognize itself as part of a system, making it easier to project predatory and abusive impulses onto the environment. Thus, an ideology of independence has resulted in a sense of entitled ownership, a kind of utilitarian perception of the natural world that relates to it through transactional relationships that do not have a sense of responsibility, care, and love. And this worldview will only continue to perpetuate planetary harm. Now, the less appreciated determinant of planetary health that I want to highlight is that of Indigenous peoples' health. And we premise very, very strongly in our group's work that the health of the planet is intrinsically tied to the health and well-being of Indigenous peoples. When Indigenous peoples have their land, culture, and their sovereignty, they are more likely to have greater well-being. Thus, they will continue to be able to sustainably care for more than 1/3 of the world's old growth forests and the most biodiverse regions on the planet. So it's imperative that Indigenous peoples' health is approached from a holistic lens that acknowledges cultural and land-based practices as being crucial for human health and for the health of the planet. Now, the last determinant of planetary health that I would like to highlight is governance and law. And governance and law reflect our explicit or our implicit agreements on lifestyle and our worldviews. Governance and legal mechanisms are translated, of course, into norms and codes that really aim to define then our interaction with Mother Earth, which right now is an interaction most often premised on development. However, many development measures and indicators, of course, as many may be aware, are not sustainable, as many are in that exponential accelerated growth pattern that we saw alongside the destruction of Mother Earth. And these unsustainable measures and indicators like GDP or gross domestic product are achieved at the expense, of course, of Mother Earth's health through not only a lifestyle of consumption that really encourages waste and dismisses relationships. Now, alternatively, Indigenous peoples have, as I had noted, natural law or first law that governs lives and embodies these complex notions of reciprocity and responsibility. Natural or first law represents, again, a comprehensive ethical framework that really defines the codes of contact necessary for maintaining a peaceful, thriving, and cooperative society grounded in love and reciprocity. Now, the governance and embodiment of natural or first laws by Indigenous peoples relates directly to the rights of Indigenous peoples. So maintaining Indigenous governance and natural or first law through negotiated instruments, but also combined with Indigenous peoples' self-determination, really is foundational to the health of the planet, as it will continue to prioritize the rights of all our relatives as well as Mother Earth, but also inclusive of Indigenous land tenure rights and many of the other determinants that came up as a part of this work. And we concluded our paper stating that Indigenous voices are a powerful and beneficial solutions-oriented force for Mother Earth's well-being and for all living beings that inhabit her. We therefore call for an inclusion of wisdom that is not mere knowledge or information, but is an insight that comes from the heart of Mother Earth. We currently have elaborate plans from the local, but also to the international level to tackle the social and ecological determinants of our own health relating directly to land. However, let's not forget about the determinants of planetary health, specifically in this story. Let's codify an equitable narrative that really sets us on a path to better relations through our understanding of the fundamental principles of interconnectedness, which really pushes back against notions of colonial land borders. We cannot solve these complex problems from the same worldview that created them in the first place, as it will continue to perpetuate this disconnect between us and the planet as relatives. Our relative, the jaguar, doesn't care about the political border between French Guiana and Brazil. The moose doesn't care about the political border between Canada and the United States. And the Arctic tern doesn't care about the political borders between Greenland through all the countries it travels over on its migration to Antarctica. The jaguar does care, however, when the rainforest gets cut down for gold mining. The moose cares when it is increasingly affected by ticks due to the changing tick habitats from climate change. And the Arctic tern cares when the polar sea ice is no longer there. Indigenous peoples currently host and live in areas that hold 80% of the world's biodiversity, and yet they only inhabit 22% of the Earth's surface. And I want to highlight here that Indigenous peoples make up 6% of the global world population. So let's think about that for a moment. 6% of the world's population host 80% of the world's biodiversity. Perhaps maybe they're doing something right. Indigenous land border, tenure rights, land back means interspecies rights. It means intergenerational rights. It means the rights of nature. It means survival for all of us. And I'd like to end today with a quote from one of my dear sister's research on land-based healing, in which one of the elders who participated shared that land-based is one of those words. It's a beautiful, wonderful term. It is bringing people back to the land and helping them become alive and remembering their humanity and their connection to all living things. We are the land. So if we remember who we are, then the same miracle that we see all around us will be us. Indigenous knowledges remind us how to walk in the world in a good way. And the path we hopefully decide to walk is together with Mother Earth as our relative. You cannot understand true medicine power in whatever capacity that may be unless you understand the nature of things. And to understand the nature of things, you need to be in nature. You need to connect to the animals, to the rocks, the plants, the stars, and the winds. So with this, I want to say Masi Cho. Thank you for your time and attention today, and I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all to talk about these topics. And they're deep and vast topics that are interconnected. So I hope this brief introduction will at least stimulate some thought and consideration as you go forward in your own journeys. And I'll note additionally that I do share quite a bit of resources and publications on my professional pages, so feel free to pop on if you're interested in this area. Masi Cho again, and I welcome any questions, comments, or discussions at this time with support from our facilitator, Masi Cho.
Masicho, Dr. Redvers, I really appreciate this talk. I think it was a very important one. And I'm just I have a question here, but I'm also going to suggest to folks that if you do have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A. And then they will get featured and asked. So I'm just going to start with the first one here, and I'm going to read from what the individual has written. So Nicole, the current evolving system has gotten us close to 8 billion people, mostly focused on more of the same. Do you believe that we have the ability or the will to learn the natural laws and relationships to land? Are you hopeful that we can see an inflection in the trajectories you showed, as the Earth seems to already be beyond its carrying capacity?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's an important one. And I think one of the things that I'm constantly reminded of from my elders is that we've seen a surge in youth activism and youth standing up around the world for their intergenerational rights. And one of my elders has mentioned that, and a lot of people don't realize that Indigenous peoples believe in reincarnation. We come in cycles of life and death, and that many of the young people that are coming back to now are actually our old elders coming back to help us during this time. That's what I've been told in terms of teaching. And I really believe it's this young generation coming through that is going to not have to shoulder the responsibilities of change, but really be the precipitators of this change as a part of it. The second piece that I feel is going to be a triggering point, and my elders have often talked about this too, is actually the crises that we're in right now: the pandemic, biodiversity loss, climate change, and even war. And many of them have told me that, Nicole, this is the time, this is the thing we've been talking about that would happen. And this is the time afterwards where people are going to start to come together because they're not going to have another choice. And this sort of movement of collectivism will be required to get through. The pandemic has had no borders, and without multilateral collaboration between regions, all regions will be affected. And I am hopeful, as more and more people are reaching out with despair, looking for something, looking for that connection, looking for meaning, looking for a relief to the feelings that they feel with despair, but also anxiety and depression, that these narratives, these stories that we have that are intergenerational, that have no connections to time or space, they're timeless, are going to be the reconnecting piece for society at large. And I truly, truly believe that. It's not going to be an easy go, and many people will unfortunately suffer in the meantime as part of that process. But as I noted, I don't say that I have hope lightly. I do have hope from the teachings of our elders and the amount that they've been through in their own lives comparatively to what we see today.
Thank you, Dr. Redvers. I have a question of my own, and I reflect on your talk, and I thought back to Sheila Watt-Cloutier wrote a book a number of years ago on the right to be cold, and she spoke about that separation and how oftentimes in climate debates and climate discussions, we look to the land and we talk about, for instance, the polar bear and the seal and the possible extinction, but there was a failure throughout all of those early debates to discuss the Inuit peoples and their connection to land. And so I think her book really spoke to that and tried to bring that back to the front, and how that was, that unique connection was really the overall health of the North could only be understood in that way. And so I'm grateful for the way that you've also framed your talk in that way. Mm-hmm. The question that I have for you is a little bit different from that. It's more or less, as a research ethicist, when I look at this and I think, how often I see Indigenous ways of knowledge and praxis being applied, one of the risks that are inherent in that process is that it gets applied in a decontextualized manner. It gets pulled out of the place where where it inhabits. And so what can we do to ensure that these knowledges are applied in the way that they're intended?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I'll make a quick comment on your first point, because Sheila's work has been foundational, and I'm very honored to have her as a mentor. And one of the things that, it just triggered me to remember was this concept of artificial divides between global south and global north, which often pervades global health discussions, as well as how we consider development, how we consider aid and support. And one of the things that, you know, becomes very apparent in the context of Indigenous peoples is we're often lumped, at least in the global North, into the global North narrative of, you know, high-income countries. Yet life expectancy in many Indigenous communities is 20 years less than non-Indigenous counterparts. And in some cases, like Pine Ridge Reservation, which is the state just below where I work, has a life expectancy 1 year greater than Haiti. Yet we're in a global North consideration from that. And Sheila's work really depicted that frustration that often happens even in circumpolar Indigenous communities about being lumped into this geopolitical global North space without that differential consideration of some of the unique issues that Indigenous peoples face that sometimes are more related to global South kinds of topics of conversations. But with regard to the contextual question, and it's something that we very strongly emphasized in the Determinants of Planetary Health paper that I had referred to, was this element of Indigenous science and what Indigenous science actually means, you know, from a definitional standpoint, because our Indigenous sciences, but also our Indigenous ways of knowing, really sort of feed forward the issue that often happens with this pan sort of Indigenous, or this, you know, pan traditional knowledge kind of approach that often pervades discussions, especially as you get higher up into regional, national, and international contexts, really diluting the context that you had noted, which is so incredibly important for these knowledges to be valued. And we specifically highlighted the dissonance that often occurs and the importance of ensuring that traditional knowledge is completely contextualized within the environment that we come from, because without it, it loses its complete meaning, it loses its complete bearing as a part of that process. And we use the Indigenous scientific method, so to speak, as this descriptive term to reference contextual practice, holistic practice, symbolic practice, nonlinear practice, relational practice, not being limited by time and space, and really using the collective observation of its people to explain our natural phenomenon through real, but also metaphoric narratives that are completely and utterly connected to the land. We cannot do it any other way, otherwise it will lack the meaning that's inherent within those respective spaces. Now, having said that, that becomes tricky when you're going into larger spaces, as noted, national, international forums. And this is where these coordinated efforts like the Determinants of Planetary Health become helpful to try to identify some of these overarching issues. And what's become very apparent in this work is most often it always comes down to values, which brings in that ethical positioning, as you had talked about. The values that are inherent, because values are what make up natural laws. And it's always mind-boggling and so amazing to me that the fundamental values that underpin those natural laws in multiple communities around the globe are often very, very similar, because they're so related to respect, reciprocity, and responsibility to those land bases. So there are efforts and opportunities to try to create those consistencies without diluting knowledges, but it's a very tricky process that needs to be done very carefully and respectfully in the context of multiple nations.
Thank you. And it makes me think how important it is that we have, you know, Indigenous voices, many Indigenous voices at these different international and national tables to be able to share their experiences, and how important it is for us as allies to, as you had stated, listen with our ears and not speak necessarily with our mouth in those moments. There is so much to learn. I also have another question here, which is from Stephanie, who appreciates your thoughts and now has an overwhelming amount of thinking to do. She's asking a bit of a futuristic question, I think, as we look to space and other planets. So can you comment on how Indigenous peoples in general feel about humans becoming multiplanetary species? I have thoughts on that, but I'm going to hand that over to you, Dr. Redvers.
Well, we are interplanetary species. The reference of And I appreciate that question. You know, I think it brings an opportunity for discussion around how we see. And one of the most interesting things that I think, you know, describes this perfectly is that in many Indigenous languages, there's not a different word for space and time. They're the same. Think about that for a while. And you'll hear creation stories, of course, of we come from the star people or we have star relatives in that way. And there's both metaphorical, symbolic, real, but also physiological and physical resemblance. Because when we say we come from stars, many people may know that every single carbon component that we have in our body is from stars, is from previously exploded stars. So we are literally of the planets that have originated within the universe. And our ceremonies are not based on Earth. They are based on the entire universe that comes into that. So as a part of those visiting ceremonial processes, elders and medicine people and that ceremony is interplanetary. It's going to other planets' realms on a regular basis. So, you know, it's kind of the I would say maybe kind of a little bit of a tease when we sort of say that we're going to, but we already do go to planets. We're already there in our ceremonies, and that's what's happening. So, you know, it brings in an interesting angle of that conversation because we think about that in different ways, of course.
Thank you, Dr. Redvers. I think there was in one of those moments where Western science connects and catches up with Indigenous science. I saw yesterday or the day before in Nature Journal that they had analyzed several meteors that had been located throughout the world and found that all of the components of life were contained within that, indicating that we are star people, or supporting perhaps the argument that we are star people. I have no other questions here, and so I'll just open up the floor again and see if anyone would like to submit some questions. I actually had another one that I had written down, but I no longer can make sense of what I have written. But I would like to thank you today for sharing and speaking to us and sharing all of the knowledges that you have learned over time. And I think that might be the close, unless there's anything else that you have to say.
No, just Masi Cho again. Thank you for having me, and enjoyed the time. And I hope everyone has a really good day and good rest of your week and weekend.
Thank you very much, Masi Cho, and have a great afternoon and weekend, everyone.